Hey, friends. Welcome to Unpolished but Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer. There's a version of faith most of us begin with that feels very certain. It's clear, it's structured, it makes sense, and in a lot of ways, it feels strong because of that. We're learning quickly, we're taking things seriously, and there's this desire to get it right that drives a lot of how we show up. Nothing about that is fake. It's real, it matters, and it's part of how our foundation starts forming. What we don't always realize in that stage is how much of what we're holding is not just truth, but our understanding of truth. Those aren't the same things. Even though they feel identical at the beginning, the way we interpret what we're learning gets shaped by things we don't always notice. Our personality, our fears, what we've been taught, and even what we hope God will be like. All of that gets layered in quietly, and it becomes the lens we use to see Him. That works for a while until life starts pressing on it. Situations come up that don't fit the framework we built. God doesn't respond in the timing or the way we expected. Things we thought would be simple turn out to be more complicated. And suddenly we're faced with a tension we didn't see coming. It can feel like something is off, like our faith isn't as strong as it used to be, when in reality what's happening is much more precise than that. Something isn't breaking, it is being refined. There's a difference between believing something and actually understanding it, and most of us don't recognize that gap until life starts pressing against what we thought we knew. In the beginning, faith often comes in clear lines. We hear truth, we receive it, and we build a framework around it that feels strong because it hasn't been tested yet. That framework helps us make sense of things early on. And it gives us direction, which is important. But it's also incomplete in ways we don't see until real life starts interacting with it in ways we didn't expect. What tends to happen in that early stage is that we don't just receive truth, we interpret it. And those interpretations get shaped by more than scripture. They're influenced by our personality, fears, what we've experienced, what we've been taught, and even what we hope God will be like. And none of that is intentional. It's just part of how we process things. But over time, it creates a version of faith that feels biblical while quietly carrying assumptions that haven't actually been tested. Those assumptions usually come from something true, but they extend beyond what was actually promised. It can look like expecting obedience to produce smoother outcomes, or assuming that trusting God will lead to clarity in every situation. It might show up in believing that closeness with God should always feel strong and steady. And if it doesn't, something must be off. None of those ideas feel wrong at first because they're connected to real truth about God's character. The problem is that they add conclusions that Scripture doesn't always guarantee. Eventually, life begins to expose the difference. Situations arise that don't fit inside the framework we built. We find ourselves doing everything we know to do, and things still don't unfold the way we expected. God doesn't respond in the timing or the clarity we thought would come. In those moments, the tension isn't just about the situation itself. It's about the gap between what we believed would happen and what is actually happening. That's where the refinement begins, even if it doesn't feel like that at the time. It rarely shows up as a dramatic shift. It's more of a quiet realization that something we held with confidence doesn't fully hold under pressure. That realization can feel unsettling because it disrupts the sense of certainty we relied on. It can even feel like something is slipping, like our faith isn't as strong as it used to be, when in reality it's being adjusted in a way that makes it more accurate. Jesus doesn't leave those assumptions untouched. He brings them into the open, not to destabilize us, but to separate what is true from what we added to it. That process requires letting go of ideas that once felt certain, and there's humility in that. It means acknowledging that something we carried for a while wasn't as complete as we thought. That doesn't feel like progress in the moment. It can feel like things are becoming less defined instead of more. Over time, though, something steadier begins to take shape. What remains after those assumptions are stripped away is not weaker, it's clearer. Our understanding of God becomes less tied to how we expected Him to act and more grounded in who He has consistently shown Himself to be. That shift doesn't remove questions, but it changes how much weight they carry. Instead of threatening everything we believe, questions begin to exist within a faith that has been tested enough to hold them. That creates a different kind of stability. Earlier on, uncertainty can feel threatening because it disrupts the structure we built. Later, it becomes something we can carry without it shaking everything. The need for constant clarity starts to loosen, not because truth matters less, but because our relationship with God is no longer dependent on having everything explained in the moment. That doesn't mean we stop seeking understanding. It means we're no longer relying on it to hold everything together. There's also a point in this process where we begin to see how much of our early faith was built on certainty rather than trust. Certainty feels strong because it gives us something defined to stand on. It creates a sense of control, even if we don't recognize it that way. As long as everything fits inside that structure, faith feels stable. But life doesn't stay inside that structure, and when it moves outside of it, we're faced with a choice we didn't know we were making. We can either try to force everything back into what we already understand, or we can allow God to expand our understanding, even when that expansion feels uncomfortable. That second option requires us to let go of the kind of certainty we were used to and move into a deeper kind of trust. That trust doesn't rely on everything being clearly mapped out. It rests on who God is, even when we don't fully understand what He's doing. That shift changes how we experience everything. Situations that once would have shaken us don't carry the same weight. Not because they're easier, but because our foundation is different. We're no longer trying to protect a framework that has to explain everything perfectly. We're learning how to remain steady even when things don't fit as neatly as they used to. That steadiness doesn't come from having fewer questions. It comes from trusting God more than our need for answers. As that shift begins to take place, something else becomes clear that we don't always expect. The areas where our understanding was off weren't always obvious weaknesses. In many cases, they actually looked like strength. They felt like conviction, clarity, confidence in what we believed. That's part of why they stayed in place as long as they did. They didn't feel like something that needed to be questioned. Over time, though, The difference between confidence and accuracy starts to surface. There's a kind of confidence that comes from knowing something is true, and that's a good thing. But there's also kind of confidence that comes from thinking we understand how everything is supposed to work. And that's where things get a little more complicated. That second kind tends to rely on patterns and expectations that make sense to us, but aren't always rooted in how God actually moves. When those expectations don't hold, it doesn't just challenge what we think, it exposes how much we were depending on our understanding to feel secure. That realization can feel disorienting because it shifts the focus from what we thought we knew to how we were using that knowledge. It reveals that some of what felt like stability was actually control in a quieter form. Not control in a manipulative or obvious way, but in the sense that we felt more settled when we believed we could anticipate how things would unfold. Once that begins to loosen, faith, faith starts to take on a different posture. Instead of trying to predict or manage how God will act, there's a growing willingness to remain open to how He actually does. That doesn't mean everything suddenly makes sense. It means we're no longer trying to force it to. There's less pressure to resolve every tension immediately and more room to sit with things that are still unfolding. That space can feel unfamiliar at first. It requires patience in places where we used to want quick answers. It requires humility in areas where we once felt certain. It asks us to trust that God is consistent even when our understanding is still catching up. That's not always comfortable, but it is where depth begins to form. Another layer that starts to emerge in this process is how much of our early faith was shaped by what we thought God expected from us rather than what He actually invited us into. There's often an underlying pressure at the beginning to get everything right, to respond correctly, to maintain a certain level of consistency that proves we're serious. That pressure doesn't usually come from God directly. It comes from our desire to do well, mixed with a limited understanding of grace. As our faith matures, that pressure begins to ease. Not because obedience matters less, but because the motivation behind it changes. It becomes less about proving something and more about responding to someone. That's a significant shift, even if it happens gradually. When obedience is tied to pressure, it feels heavy and fragile. It depends on our ability to maintain it perfectly. But when it's rooted in relationship, it becomes steadier. It's still intentional, still matters, but it's no longer driven by fear of getting it wrong. It's shaped by trust, by knowing who God is and responding accordingly. That difference changes how we handle failure as well. Early on, failure can feel like a setback that threatens everything. It feels like evidence that something isn't working or that we've somehow stepped outside of where we're supposed to be. But later, it becomes something we navigate differently. It still matters, but it doesn't carry the same weight of instability. It becomes part of the process rather than something that defines us. That doesn't make us careless, it makes us more grounded. Because now our faith isn't being held together by how well we perform. It's being held by who God is, even when we're still learning how to follow Him more consistently. And all of this takes time. It doesn't happen in one clear moment where everything suddenly shifts into place. It unfolds through experience, situations that stretch us, moments where what we believe meets what we're actually living. And some of those moments feel clarifying, others feel confusing, but all of them contribute to a faith that is becoming more aligned with reality instead of just our expectations. And that's where things start to settle in a way they couldn't before. Not because everything is figured out, but because we're no longer depending on having everything figured out to feel secure. There's a quiet confidence that begins to take shape, one that isn't built on certainty in every detail, but on a growing trust in God Himself. That kind of confidence doesn't need to prove itself. It holds, even in the places that are still developing. As those earlier layers begin to fall away, what replaces them doesn't arrive all at once or in a way that draws attention to itself. There isn't a clear moment where everything suddenly feels stronger or more certain. In fact, for a while, it can feel like less because the intensity that marked the beginning isn't always there in the same way. The urgency settles, the emotional highs even out, and what's left can feel quieter than expected. That can be confusing if we're still measuring faith by how it feels, because it no longer carries that same immediate sense of clarity. What's actually taking place is more structural than emotional. Faith is becoming less dependent on how it feels in the moment and more rooted in something that can hold over time. The relationship with God starts to move out of a reactive space and into something steadier, something that doesn't need constant reassurance to remain intact. That doesn't mean everything is suddenly easier. It means there's less pressure to constantly interpret what's happening and more room to stay grounded even when things are still unfolding. This is where trust begins to function differently. Earlier on, trust often feels tied to understanding. When things make sense, it's easy to feel confident. When they don't, it's easy to feel unsettled. As faith matures, that connection starts to loosen. Trust becomes less about having clarity in every situation and more about knowing who God is, even when clarity is limited. That doesn't eliminate questions, but it changes how much control those questions have. There's also a noticeable difference in how we respond to situations that would have disrupted us before. The same kinds of challenges can still show up. They don't carry the same internal weight. Instead of immediately trying to resolve everything or make sense of it right away, there's a greater willingness to let things unfold without forcing a conclusion. That doesn't come from indifference, it comes from a growing awareness that not everything needs to be figured out in the moment for us to remain steady. That steadiness changes how we engage with truth as well. Earlier, truth can feel like something we need to hold tightly in order to stay grounded, as if maintaining it depends on how well we manage it. Over time, that pressure begins to ease. Truth doesn't become less important, but it becomes less fragile. Instead of something we're trying to protect, it becomes something we live within. And that shift creates a sense of stability that isn't dependent on constant effort. What begins to take shape is that spaces of faith that is less performative and more relational. The focus moves away from trying to maintain a certain standard outwardly and settle into something more internal and consistent. Following Jesus becomes less about reacting correctly in every situation and more about remaining connected to Him through whatever is happening. That kind of connection doesn't rely on intensity to feel real. It holds, even when things feel ordinary. Looking back, it becomes easier to see that the beginning was never meant to be the final form. It was a necessary starting point, but it didn't yet have the depth that comes from being lived out over time. What exists now may not feel as sharp or as immediate, but it is more stable. It has been shaped by real situations, adjusted where needed, and clarified in ways that couldn't have happened without experience. That doesn't mean everything is finished or fully formed. Growth continues, and there will always be areas that are still developing. The difference is that faith is no longer dependent on everything being fully understood to remain intact. It has learned how to hold its ground, even while things are still being worked out. That's where it becomes clear that nothing essential has been lost. What has changed is how it's carried, and that change is what allows it to last. There's something grounding about recognizing that the faith we started with was never meant to stay exactly the same. It was real, it mattered, and it gave us a place to begin. But it also needed to grow beyond that starting point. That growth doesn't mean we've moved away from truth. It means we've moved into a deeper understanding of it, one that can actually hold in the middle of real life. If things feel different now than they did at the beginning, that isn't automatically a sign that something is off. In many cases, it's a sign that something has been refined in a way that allows it to remain steady without relying on the same kind of intensity or clarity we once depended on. That kind of faith may feel quieter, but it is also more grounded and more able to carry us forward. Instead of trying to return to how things felt at the start, there's an invitation to let what has been built continue to develop. That process may not always feel obvious, but it is moving in a direction that is more stable and more aligned with who God actually is. If you would like to keep walking this out a little deeper, everything connected to what we're building here, including the 5 Days Start Here guide, is linked in the show notes. You can also find me on Facebook under my name for deeper conversations or questions, where I am most active and available. Thanks for sitting in this conversation with me, and we'll talk again soon.